Hi, everybody. My name is Hadar Harris, and I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Human Rights and Humanitarian Law here at the Law School. We are very happy to see so many of you here to talk with us and to think about and to learn about and to hear about human rights perspectives in the upcoming U.S. election. As you might have heard, there's going to be an election in this country on November 6th. And if you are registered to vote, which we hope that you are, we strongly, strongly hope that you will go to vote for whichever candidate you decide to vote for. One of the things from our perspective at the Center for Human Rights and Humanitarian Law, though, is that everyone who is registered to vote or should be registered to vote or could be registered to vote can do that and can exercise their right to vote from a nonpartisan perspective. Today's event is going to talk about that. A couple of announcements before I frame our discussion a little bit more specifically. And we are so very pleased to have two incredible speakers with us today, taking time out of their real work to protect this and other elections taking place in the world today. But before we do that, I would be not doing my job if I didn't make a couple of announcements while I have you all captive here. One of them being for Halloween trick-or-treating next Wednesday on October 31st, the Center, under the leadership of the Center Student Advisory Board, will be holding a session on cool human rights work I did on my summer vacation. And it will be some of your peers, law students from WCL, talking about very interesting human rights experiences that they had over the summer, talking about ways that they got their summer jobs and strategies for funding their summer jobs, which might be relevant to a couple of you. So this will be in this room, 602, next Wednesday at 12 o'clock. I also wanted to let Ashley make an announcement about a training session that's going to be come up that will be directly relevant from a nonpartisan perspective with what we're going to talk about today.
Hi guys, thanks for just listening to me for a few minutes. As many are, you're all here because you're interested in this year's election and hopefully in protecting and promoting the right to free and fair elections in the U.S. and throughout the world. And part of what Hadar mentioned is, we really want to make sure everybody has an opportunity to vote. And part of helping promote that this year by being a poll monitor at a polling location in Virginia, or if you prefer in Maryland. We have a number of trainings still that we're doing to equip you with the tools to go out on election day and be a resource there for folks who feel like they're being barred from the opportunity or the election. So we have a training tomorrow with the Lawyers Committee from 11 to 1 in room 100. And there are trainings on tomorrow evening and then on Saturday and then again next weekend that will be held by Organizing for America. The dates are posted on the elevator, but if you'd like more information, you can visit electionprotection2012.wordpress.com. All the dates are listed there, and sort of what a broader overview of what it means to be a poll worker and how crucially important it is, especially in Virginia, where the election law has changed since the last election. So if you're interested, we'd really love to have you and give you the training and the skills necessary to make a big impact on elections. Oh, sorry. And you also get legal pro bono hours because the polls are open from 6 to 7. That's 13 whole hours. You can knock out if you're able to finish the whole day.
Great. Thank you, Ashley. So I want to note that today's event is co-sponsored by the Program on Law and Government as well as the Center for Human Rights. And I also want to thank Whitney Hayes, who's been instrumental in putting today's event together. I think she just stepped out of the room. My interest in election monitoring was piqued when I had the opportunity to be part of a joint UN-OSCE election monitoring team in Nakhchivan, Azerbaijan in 1995. Look on a map, maybe you'll find it. In 1995, Azerbaijan was having its first independent parliamentary elections, and I was part of a team that was monitoring those elections after Azerbaijan had declared its independence from the Soviet Union, something that some of you might have heard about some time ago. Anyway, I was sent out to this really remote location, and I had friends who were organizing, assigning people to different places, and I told them afterwards that it was clear that they didn't like me very much because they had sent me to this location. I had a Danish diplomat as my partner, and it was freezing. It was remote. We were up really early in the morning until really, really late at night, and it was incredibly corrupt. There was secret police intimidating voters, fathers coming in with wads of passports to vote on behalf of their whole family. There was a comedic incident that I swear to you really happened, where there was a secret policeman that went into the voting booth with the voter, but it was backlit. So you could see him going like this, directing the person where to vote and how to vote. And it was kind of capped off by observing the counting of the ballots, when this little old lady who was part of the election commission, wearing a little scarf over her head, sitting in the corner in a very cold room while I was drinking a cup of tea, very hospitably offered to us by the chair of the election commission, was sitting there in the corner kind of integrating all of the ballots, and I see this guy in a big, long, black leather trench coat standing behind her take a wad of ballots out of his pants, literally, put it onto the table. She doesn't even move and integrates the ballots right in. I, unfortunately, made a gasping noise because I couldn't really believe what I was seeing. And for the rest of the evening, as we followed the ballot box back to the Central Election Commission through windy, remote roads, I was envisioning the tiny little article on page D2 of the New York Times about the horrific car crash that this American and Danish election monitors had been a part of. Happily, clearly that didn't happen, but the election certainly opened my eyes to something that happens in various parts of the world in different ways. A few months later, I was back in San Francisco practicing law, back at home, and I went to vote because there was an election in the States. And I went to vote in the basement of a church, and I went to sign in, and they gave me a pencil to sign my name to show that I had been there to vote. And I said to the little old ladies who were the election monitors, or who were staffing the elections, you really shouldn't have people sign in pencil. And they said, why? It's no big deal. Like, nobody's going to erase it. And I said, but they could. And you really need to have people signing in pens. And they said, well, the elections people gave us pencils, and so people are signing in pencils. So being the excellent international human rights attorney that I was, I went back to my law firm office on the 800 millionth floor of the high-rise building and called the Bureau of Elections and lodged a formal complaint. The problem was I was billing my time as a practicing attorney, and the Election Commission wasn't terribly sensitive to that because when I explained the problem, they really didn't know what to do about it. And they transferred me from one person to another person to another person, really not thinking that this was a big deal, until an hour later, 60 billable minutes later, somebody, gave me what was considered to be the right answer. Thank you very much, ma'am, and hung up the phone. So 5 years later, suddenly in this country, nobody was talking about pencils, but people were talking about hanging chads. And people were talking about election processes and how they work in this country and where some of the roadblocks and some of the bumps in the road have been and will be as elections take place all around this country in the coming year. So let me be clear again. Our discussion today is from a nonpartisan perspective. We have invited two amazing people who have devoted their time and their lives to creating standards, in the case of Pat Merlot, and observing elections for free and fair elections all around the world, and protecting elections in this country through the Lawyers Committee in Marcia's case for many years. Quick introductions. Pat Merlot, sitting next to me, is the Director of Electoral Programs at the National Democratic Institute, a nonprofit and nonpartisan organization working to support and strengthen democratic institutions worldwide through citizen participation, openness, and accountability in government. I wonder how long it took to get that crystallized. That's good. I know. He has over 30 years of experience in promoting citizen empowerment, governmental accountability, and public policy advocacy.
In other words, I'm old.
And has participated, and here he's tired, in over 150 international missions for NDI to more than 65 countries, having returned just recently from Georgia, the country of, correct?
Yes.
I heard a little rumor.
Lima, Peru.
And Lima, Peru. So we are so really pleased to have him here to talk about the creation and implementation of international standards for free and fair elections. In addition, we have Marcia Johnson Blanco, who's the co-director of the Lawyers Committee Voting Rights Project, where she directs the areas of election protection, election reform, census and redistricting, and felony disenfranchisement. And to say that all really quickly 3 times is somewhat difficult. She is in crunch time here as we are rocketing towards the election, and so having you, scared and crunch time. But she's thinking also about how international standards apply as she serves on the International Law Committee of the Lawyers Committee and has been monitoring compliance of the U.S. obligations under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Both of them have much longer biographies, but I will leave it at that and say again how grateful and thankful we are that both of you are taking time, jet-lagged and freaked out, prior to these elections to join us today. What we thought we would do is each of them would talk for about 10 minutes, and then we would open up to a much broader discussion. Much of what they're going to talk about, I am sure, will spawn many questions and comments and thoughts in your own minds, and so we want to leave adequate time for that conversation. So with that, Pat, would you like to turn your light on?
Turn the light on.
Turn the light on. You're on.
So I'll bow to the temptation to say that I thought this was Halloween. That's why I wore a costume. And to say to Haidar that her experience in Nakhchivan, a place that I know and love, which is a subset of Azerbaijan, which is another place that I know and love, which is engulfed inside another country called Armenia, which is another place that I know. Is a very tough neighborhood. In fact, one of my friends who is a colleague in sorts of all of us, including Marcia, who is a citizen election monitor from that country, upon her arrival at the airport, was beaten up. That's the way she was greeted. And internationals often are treated much more nicely than people from their own country who are going out trying to ensure that electoral integrity actually is taking place. And in that sense, I do want to say, a plug for the Lawyers Committee and all the other organizations that have been mobilizing voter protection issues in the United States over a long period of time. My colleague Dixon Omondi from Kenya is here with me, but I'm a citizen of this country, and my start was here around voting rights and human rights in this country, dealing with police brutality, but also dealing with what happened not just in the South, but in the cities in the North. And while I've moved off to the international arena, what's happening here is really critical to each of us as citizens, but to every other citizen around the world. Because not only does the politics and the policy of the United States matter, the image of the United States matters. And when people look to us and see that we actually are realizing our own democracy, as difficult as it is, that universal and equal suffrage means something, it's for real in this country, that really gives inspiration to people to stand up in Zimbabwe, to stand up in Guatemala against the narco-traffickers, to go to the polls when their lives are endangered for what they might vote. It really makes a difference, and this woman is a hero. So, having said that, let me just ask this couple of questions. First, I'll go from the narrow to the broad number of hands. How many of you have already taken international human rights law and done some sort of specialty in human rights? Okay, so there's a few. I know that. How many of you have been involved in electoral-related law? Have you taken courses on that? Some of you are the same, so we should talk afterwards. And then all of you are here because you're interested in elections and you think it's important. So I've been asked to say a few things about the framework, the international human rights and legal framework for democratic elections. I'll say a little bit about that. There's a lot that can be said. The American Bar Association has a book about this thick on international principles for democratic elections, in which I was asked to do a lead piece in it. There are Guy Goodwin Gill from the International Parliamentary Union did a wonderful piece on this. The European Union, this is all about international standards for democratic elections and how it should be applied. Once upon a time, I did something on how you do legal frameworks for democratic elections. And most recently, Kofi Annan and a number of outstanding personalities after the experience in Kenya when more than 1,000 people died as a consequence of a bad election in 1907 1908, created a global commission on elections, democracy, and security. And their report, which just came out in September, also gives not just a framework legally, but it talks about what needs to be done to try to address and improve this all over the world. And they're relevant to the United States, but since I'm in a show and tell mood, I have to use the visual aids that I think are most important for today's discussion. And if those of you who can afford the $20, this book on voter suppression in the United States by Tova Wang, which takes a long historical perspective. It's not about right now. It's not about Democrats and Republicans only. It's about Whigs and know-nothings and others. But it puts this in a framework and a way to understand what's going on for us presently as we look into our own future that I think is really inspiring. And if you can't afford that, go to the NAACP Legal Defense Fund's website and download this report, which looks back over the last few years and breaks out some of the things I know you're going to say, so I'm not going to say much about that. There's a lot that's out there, but we can get to it really quickly, the core of it. I think we all know about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and for those of you who are steeped in it, I won't go too deeply into it, but Article 21 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which of course 1948, unanimously adopted at the United Nations, only 7 extensions. That article says that the authority and legitimacy of government derives from the will of the citizens expressed in genuine elections that are held by universal and equal suffrage, secret ballot, and so on. And it starts from the premise in that article that every citizen has the right to participate in government, directly, standing for office, participating in referendums, town meetings, and so on, or indirectly by choosing their representatives through elections. And those, I won't go through the litany of it, but if you go on to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Article 25, further elaborated by the UN Human Rights Committee about what the substance of that should be interpreted to mean as obligations for the over 160 countries that are parties to that treaty. If you look at the Inter-American Convention, if you look at declarations within the Inter-American system, you look at judicial decisions within the Inter-American system, if you look at the European system and see what's there in the European Convention on Human Rights and the European Court for Human Rights rulings, if you look in the new African Charter on democracy and elections, you will see that there is a tremendous body of international wisdom and international obligations that have been taken up. And that over the last 30 years, there is a classic example of what we all study, a normative process that is underway, a process by which states are expected to live up to obligations and are indeed changing behavior to meet those obligations, being enacted in constitutions, domestic law, and so on. And just let me say 2 things before I get off of that. One is, yes, international observation takes place based upon all of these various declarations. But international observation is really like inviting someone to dinner. They can talk afterwards about how well the family behaved. But international observers didn't really know what went into the preparation of the food, nor did they really know much about the relationships between the people before and after they left. And while I've done this in more than 60 countries and worked with the community of people that have a Declaration of Principles for International Observation, the main thing that takes place is the relationship between citizens among themselves and between citizens and their government and their state. The obligation of each state to provide a genuine opportunity for citizens to exercise sovereignty, which resides in them, and to pick the people who are going to govern on their behalf, is really as sacred as the Constitution itself. And to look at that and to understand that, the international principles, I think, help us in two respects. First, the right to participate. That means that every single citizen has the right to be involved in the political and in the suffrage in the electoral process. The concept of universal and equal suffrage, which is really a subset of the norm against discrimination, means that the equal protection of the law has to extend to every person to be able to genuinely exercise that right. And we all know about the exceptions that you can make and what are proper exceptions, restrictions upon rights. That has to be applied in an electoral context. I mean, that's really what it's all about. And the second thing is, for citizens to know that an election process is genuine, they have to be able to see it. It has to be transparent. And so the right of citizens to actually look into and monitor every element of an election process is also part of the normative process that's been taking place around the world. And to see the Lawyers Committee, to see the NAACP, People for the American Way, organizations that are around the Cato Institute and further on that side of the spectrum as well, engage in this process is also an integral part of exercise of basic rights. So if there's anything in the international arena that can illuminate the circumstance that we're in, I believe that's it. And then, as I said, less than 10 minutes, even with the bad attempts at some humor, it's worthwhile to understand what's obvious. You can't have a genuine election unless people are free to associate with one another, are free to gather in assemblies, listen, hear, are free to associate in order to seek the votes on behalf of a candidate or a political party, are free as an individual to seek office, the other aspect of suffrage, to go out and freely campaign, to have access through the media as well as door-to-door activities. It's not possible unless people actually get adequate, impartial information. And it's certainly not possible if people seek to block and interfere through undue burdens and manipulations, dirty tricks, intimidation, and other sorts of things, which do happen in many countries. And we can talk about how that escalates into examples of violence in places like Zimbabwe, how it undermines the nature of democracy in places like Guatemala, as I mentioned, with the influence of narco-trafficking into politics and corruption and how that affects it. But it also has an impact in countries like this one. And I think that's where I should stop. That's the natural place for you to start.
Well, thank you. First, before I begin, I'd like to thank Professor Harris and Whitney Hayes for the invitation. And I mentioned that I was a bit scared and freaked out, and it has to do with the enormity of the challenge that we've taken on at the Lawyers Committee, and as the leader of election protection, to build an army of monitors who help voters to access our election process and ensure to help them build the confidence that they're going to cast a ballot that will be counted. And what I find now in the U.S. is that we are sort of having an identity crisis. We simultaneously believe that we are the greatest democracy in the world, and yet increasingly have less confidence about how we elect our leaders. And I think that has to do with the opening of our eyes as to how election administration works. And it started, as Professor Harris alluded to, in the presidential election of 2000, where 537 votes stood between the victor and the defeated, and how we can verify those 537 votes became an issue that became part of our national debate, and how elections work, who are poll workers, or how lists are assembled, our voter registration system and how it works. All of that became part of our public discourse, and we saw that election administration and how it's applied can really have an effect on the outcome of our elections. It can really decide who the winner is, particularly when we're so evenly divided. So few people, not as everyone who should vote doesn't always vote. So you have a limited pool of voters, an evenly divided partisan landscape, and then you have these razor-thin margins separating the victor from the winner, from the loser, and any problems with election administration can play a significant role in determining who wins. So we came out of Florida saying we have to do something about this, and we spent 2 years debating and resulted in the Help America Vote Act of 2002. And what that act and the result of the act shows sort of the tension between those who believe that there's fraud in our system and everything should be done to root out the fraud, versus there should be access to every voter who believes that they are eligible and who shows up and does the right things in terms of registering and shows up to vote on election day. So the way that tension between fraud and access played out in the Help America Vote Act was between allowing provisional ballots. So what provisional ballots allow is any voter who shows up at a polling place on election day and says, I registered, I'm eligible, and even though my name is not on the list, I should be given the opportunity to vote. They're given a ballot, and that ballot is later verified. And the trade-off for allowing for provisional ballots was to introduce ID into the system. Now, not all states require a documentary identification in order to be able to vote. Lots of times, as Professor Harris alluded to, you sign your name in. It's a signature matching system. Or you show a range of identification from a utility bill to verify your address, bank statements, government-issued ID. So we got provisional ballots and we got ID for first-time voters. And that just opened the floodgates into a battle that I've been engrossed in now since Georgia first issued its first ID law in 2005, and that is the use of restricted voter identification to limit those who have access to the ballot. And I'm sure you're all here, so I know you have a student ID. You all have some form of ID, and a lot of people think, well, what's the big deal? Everyone has ID. The big deal is everyone doesn't have ID. And what states have been doing, and increasingly since 2010, is restricting the type of ID that is required in order to vote. When I first started doing election protection in 2004, and I worked in a state like Florida. Florida keeps coming up a lot in discussions about election administration and suppression. There were 17 different types of IDs you can use, and this is a dated reference, but I like to use it, including your Blockbuster card. They thought of what types of IDs could the electorate have, and it was included in the list. But increasingly, states are saying, no, you can only have a state-issued, unexpired identification. Now, this is a country where we're not given, in some countries in the world, an ID at birth. My husband is from Argentina. They have the national identification card. You do not leave home without it. I mean, it's part of your intrinsic makeup. We don't have that. What we have as forms of IDs generally is an employer ID, a driver's license, and then we can expand from there. So when you start requiring just state-specific, government-issued IDs, you're excluding eligible voters from the pool. And that's the battle we've been in for these past 2 years. When Georgia first issued its ID requirement and said you had to have a driver's license or a state-issued ID, we went to court, and the court said, well, requiring voters to get this ID is a poll tax because you have to pay for it. It's now given for free. So Georgia went back to the drawing board and said, okay, now we're going to have free voter IDs. And the court said that's okay. Indiana followed suit and said, okay, free ID. And the Supreme Court said yes, because there's this patina of voter fraud that election officials are trying to counter. Yet the Supreme Court didn't ask the legislature of Indiana to show the voter fraud that influenced the need for this ID. They went all the way back to Tammany Hall in the 1800s to show that, yes, there could be fraud in the system. So the burden was not on the state to show that there is a fraud and this law is addressing that particular fraud, but on the voter to show there isn't any, so I don't need it. So since Indiana and Georgia, other states have followed suit, and we've been fighting this, and it's against this backdrop of what's the big deal? Everyone has ID. Everyone doesn't have ID, but the people who don't have ID, they're not the ones that are mainly seen in our society. You know, they're the poor and maybe the disabled or a senior citizen who lives, you know, that doesn't have a car anymore. And so it's this slice of our electorate, and yet there's the fraud debate that's going on. We actually did polling recently, and we were told, don't talk about voter fraud because people just believe it exists, and you're just, you know, batting your head against the wall, and it's really frustrating to me. So I do take solace in, like, the News 21 report that shows, no, there's no voter fraud. And then Jane Mayer, the New Yorker, just came through, you know, she did an article with a study that shows it doesn't exist. But it's a futile exercise, I'm told. But, you know, I figure you're an informed audience. I could beat my drum and talk about access. So one of the other things that came out of Florida in 2000 is organizations like the Lawyers Committee that did voting litigation, enforcing statutes such as the Voting Rights Act or the National Voter Registration Act, decided that we need to have a program where we affirmatively help voters before and on election day. And that's how election protection was born. And we've become increasingly ambitious. We have the 866, our vote hotline that voters can call in. And increasingly, voters are calling in to report rumors as well as just to verify their information so they can show up at the polls armed, and increasingly realizing that there's something that voters have to do themselves and not just assume that I registered and I'm fine, but they have to affirmatively verify that before going to the polls. And so we are now in a system where there's a lot more we need to do to confirm that our eligibility to participate in our election system. And there, on the other side, those who are scrutinizing to make sure that there is none of this phantom fraud happening, and there's just a lot of debate and attention happening there, and it's just basically consuming our debate and our public perception of elections. And I'll just leave it there, because I think I went over. But happy to answer any questions.
Let me ask a question just to get started, and then we'll have everybody raise questions. So there's no national identity card here. There's no way to actually kind of verify who's who, right? And it's always struck me as a little bit odd when you go and you vote that you just sign your name. So I don't know if anybody's thought about what the fact that fraud doesn't really exist, that we're kind of hyping this a little bit too much. But are there other ways that elections can be verified that's going to be fair, that would be inclusive, that would be given how our system already works? And what would that look like?
I mean, I don't want to imply that there's no system in place to verify the voter. Because the signature matching, you match your signature against when you registered to vote, you had your signature on there. And there were other forms in terms of, I'm not going to have your utility bill, like for example. What our concern is the restrictions of that verification process, that is removing eligible voters from the voting pool. So we can have a conversation about how we verify and make sure that there's that trust in our system, but don't do it in a way such that it restricts eligible voters.
Questions, comments, thoughts? Sir, please identify yourself.
My name is Greg Evans. I'm a student here. I had a conversation about this subject matter with a friend of mine that does with future predictions. And what I was wondering, and I'd like to propose for both of you all to answer is there a reasonable time period for a state to require IDs? Because I don't personally have an issue with a person having to show an ID, but I do understand there is an agenda behind what's happening and that people don't have an ID. But is there, like, if they said today, the next presidential election you need to have an ID, would that 4-year time period be appropriate in your opinion?
Let me try to. I think both your and Hyder's question go to this. What's fundamental? And in every circumstance, there's competing interests. So on the one hand, if we agree that elections should be by universal and equal suffrage, then that means there's certain restrictions. We say it have to be 18. It used to be 21. I mean, I'm old enough to be around when we fought to amend the Constitution of the United States so that people could be 18 could vote. And Common Cause was one of the leading forces in doing that. But you can have a restriction, an age restriction. You can say if somebody has been proven not to be able to make a sound judgment, that person shouldn't be allowed to vote or do other things. I mean, so it's not an absolute right. So now we're talking about restrictions, and we're in a law school, so we all know about what the tests are, about the restrictions that can be put on. What's a reasonable restriction? How do you balance legitimate state interests? So on the one hand, the fundamental right is for universal and equal suffrage. So equal opportunity to get to the polls and so on. That's implied. On the other hand, you have the obligation to ensure that it's honest so that there's not fraud. So you have to have some constraints on fraud. I think this point about what's the concern that you need to address. Has there been widespread impersonation of registered voters and voting on their behalf? That's what the issue of presenting a photo ID or a fingerprint. I mean, biometric information is collected in some countries. There are voter ID cards in Mexico that not only have your picture, not only your signature, it has your fingerprint. So what's the point you're trying to get at, the threat, the risk that you're trying to get at? There has not been demonstrated, and there have been many studies now, academic, all sides of the aisle, there has not been demonstrated that there is presently in the United States of America a significant risk of people going into polling stations and impersonating other people and fraudulently voting. So if you're going to put a burden, a restriction, then by all of the court standards that we know, you have to come up with a restriction that's commensurate to addressing this particular problem. So, all right, is it a burden to have a driver's license? Well, it can be a burden to have a driver's license. So I think the courts in Pennsylvania have addressed this in one way by saying you can't do it this time, but there's enough time the next time. So let me back off just a little bit and give another example, because sometimes using another country helps to make the point clear. In Nicaragua, you have to be on the voters registry and have a new voter ID card in order to be able to go to the polls and vote. If you don't have the card, you can't vote. If you show up with the card and your name's not on the register, you can't vote. Fine. It's not difficult to get the voter ID card if you look at the voter registration process. The problem is, to get a voter ID card, though, you have to be able to present a birth certificate. It's almost impossible to get birth certificates if you are someone who lives out in the rural areas where there's not been registered births. In Pakistan, same issue. So the question isn't, should you have a voter ID card? The question is there a barrier that's preventing people from getting universal and equal suffrage? And I think that's the question we have to ask about this issue of IDs in the United States. Two points to cut to the chase. One is, what's the risk that we are trying to mitigate? And then what's a reasonable burden to put on the population in order to mitigate that risk? And then what's the nature of removing the barriers to reduce that burden so that you're realizing universal and equal suffrage? And that, I think that can come out different in different countries or different states because this is decentralized. But you're at the crux of it. If we're going to require everybody get a voter ID, then do we have the money to mobilize mobile vehicles to go around neighborhoods to let everybody know well in advance that the vehicle's going to be here next week, on hours when people are actually home? We're going to help citizens who are old and to know about that and help get them to that vehicle. Are we going to do the kind of things that would really make it possible for everybody who is eligible to vote to actually have that requirement met to bring that ID card with? If we're not prepared to spend the money to educate the people, to put the implementations in place to realize this, then what we're really doing is we're just hiding the fact that we're denying universal suffrage. Without taking a stand about who gets denied the right to vote and how that plays out politically, I just think that's a universal principle that every place in the world, and I've taught classes on comparative law. That's just basic jurisprudence.
Thank you.
And what I would just add really quickly, you talk about the time frame, but Mr. Miller brought up a great point about the cost. So, the court said you have to make the ID free. But in order to get a driver's license in this country, in most states, you have to show underlying documents, such as a birth certificate. Not just any birth certificate, a certified copy of your birth certificate. Who here has access to their certified copy? You have to pay to get that certified copy of your birth certificate. It takes time to get that certified copy of your birth certificate. So, there have been states passing these laws with different requirements, and Virginia passed an ID law. And, to get to your point about, what's an acceptable time for an acceptable ID, and there was a lot of pushback from groups in the community. So what Virginia decided is that a voter registration card is going to be an acceptable ID. And then they're going to mail a voter registration card to every eligible voter, whether they believe you have the card currently or not. And so then you're passing an ID law, but you're also providing access to the identification. And so you can, that's sort of the balancing that we're looking at. But when you pass a law that has a requirement that all eligible voters can't meet, that's where the problems begin. And that's why the court in Pennsylvania said it's not going to be eligible for this election. And the district court in D.C. for the Texas and South Carolina ID laws have also struck those down.
So voter ID laws are terrible. I get that idea. The full effort poll suggests that despite the facts we're using tonight, the Americans by and large believe that voter ID laws are okay. And I think that the voter ID law has gone beyond what it was. Like, it's been used as a ruse in states like Florida, where the administration of elections has gone way beyond just voter ID laws, like 180,000 names happen to be Hispanic being removed from the polls, from the poll list, or potentially finding somebody for misdating. Like in Florida, if you're a third-party voter registrar, you can be charged up to $1,000.
Not anymore, but yes,
not
they
anymore,
did.
because of course. But what I'm saying is, I feel like a lot of the attacks on what we do are based on the voter ID lens, and I feel like what we should do is focusing more on what they're doing in far more egregious fashion, which is people doing this have said, oh, it's voter ID, it's okay, but actually they're doing all these things behind that curtain. Why not focus our efforts on those things instead of the voter ID issue? As terrible as it is, we are losing that type of fight right now.
Well, we are. I mean, we did bring litigation against the third-party voter registration law. We are looking at the purges. We actually filed a lawsuit in Florida against the purges because they were using faulty databases. So you're right. It's a fight on multiple fronts. It's the ID. It's the attack on third-party voter registration groups. It's reducing opportunities for early voting. It's deceptive practices, which we're now getting calls into the hotline in Florida again, of voters getting calls, not a robocall this time, which is interesting, but from a call center saying, oh, you can vote by phone, give me your information. And so it is a massive all fronts attack. I mean, I focused on ID, but you're right, it's not just limited to that.
I think you're right. The ID question, where someone asked that question, the ID question is an important one. I was with President Carter in Mexico in 2000 for the 2000 election, and Mexico made a tremendous effort and managed to put voter ID cards in almost everybody's hands. And he turned and said, Pat, wouldn't it be great if we could do that in the United States? And with due respect, I said, it would be great if we could realize it. I mean, the question is, how do we realize it? So I do think it could be realized. We have the capacity. If you can do it in Denmark, and you can do it in Mexico, you could do it in the United States. The question is, do we have the capacity, the will, the ability to implement it? And if it's being implemented, citizens of goodwill who care about electoral integrity should monitor that process, not just the political parties. The political parties certainly should look after it. That's one thing. But you raise a number of other points. I mean, first, voter ID is one issue. It's an important issue. Second, the moves that have been done to restrict early voting is restricting an enfranchisement that has been extended over a period of time. The trend around the world is to extend enfranchisement, to try to realize universal suffrage. There is an attack about that, to try to roll that back in a number of states. So early voting is another issue. Who early votes? Again, it tends to be people who work, blue-collar people, people who are older, and certain populations are affected.
President, he's voting today, evidently.
Yeah, and I'll vote on Saturday here, in the district. But that's another very important area. When you look at the issue of the felony voting, the general trend around the world is that you have to go back to basic jurisprudence again. Penalties have to be proportionate to the crime. Is it proportionate to deny a person the right to vote, a basic fundamental right as a citizen, for their entire life because they committed a felony? Once they've served their time, in most countries in the world, they're allowed to vote automatically. And in some countries, you get to vote even if you're in prison. The United States is not in tune with the general trend in the world on this point.
But not all states.
But not all states, but I'm talking about the country as a whole. We're out of step. And in certain states, in the last few years, there have been increased restrictions. It's harder for people to have their voting rights restored after serving their time, if you were a felon, than it was a few years ago in a certain number of states. Now, I would ask you, go look at those states and see if there's some disparate political impact that might be a consequence of that. That's a second question that a court should ask, because the non-discrimination norm includes not just race, gender, and so on. It also includes political opinion. If you look at the Universal Declaration or the Covenant, and if you look at jurisprudence around the world, if you look at U.S. jurisprudence, because a lot of people in this country don't want to apply international law in our courts. So that's another issue. This issue of purging voter lists of non-citizens. Again, what's the threat of non-citizen voting in U.S. elections? All of the studies that have been done show there is a minimal to non-existent threat. And yet, there are states where voter rolls are being purged of people who might be non-citizens. There's a discriminatory effect on those people based upon their surnames. That's another problem. So we could go through a range of problems that are out there and how people who are trying to have essentially equal protection of the law and equality before the law, which are fundamental precepts of the Constitution of the United States and the jurisprudence of this country, let alone international standards, to apply those. And I think it's incumbent upon us to do that. There will be those who will fight to make certain issues bigger than they are in order to create barriers to voting to gain some political advantage. That's been true ever since the vote was allowed, when people voted with pebbles. But you got to counter it. If you really, and I'm not talking about political party, if you really believe in universal suffrage, we have to find ways, and you're absolutely right. We have to concentrate on this whole range of things to empower people. And last but not least, because I'm making a speech, sorry, the 1 o'clock class had started, so you guys are stuck with hearing the speech. But last but not least on this, citizens have to feel that they're actually being encouraged to vote. The message that's going out should be, inclusiveness. This is universal. You're a citizen. You get to choose who represents you. Come on to the polls. Not, we just want you to know that if you come to the polls, you might be violating a law. Don't make a big mistake. That's not really a message of inclusiveness. And how does that get counted? I believe that a state has the duty to counter those messages with sponsored political or non-paid, non-political, non-partisan advertisements saying everybody who is registered should come out and vote. And before that, everybody who's eligible should register. I mean, that message should be a clarion call to every citizen in every country, including in our own. And these other things should be drowned out by that call. And if that's not happening, I would suggest that there's something not right.
I think another question I have is about people who can register other people to vote. I know recently there was something in the news about someone throwing out ballots or throwing out registrations. So I'm wondering, what can we do to make sure the people who will register aren't going to be the types of people who throw them out?
Yeah, I mean, that is really a problem because they are increasing attacks on third-party voter registration groups. And the way these third-party voter registration groups, whether it's your church, the local NAACP, any community organization, got that right through the National Voter Registration Act is because of intimidation that voters faced when going to the county to register, and it was about opening up the process. And now what we find is that process is also being used for political gain. And there are groups who are going out pretending to, want to involve folks into the system, but are instead making sure that those voters are not part of the system. And one of the things that the Lawyers Committee is fighting for is voter registration reform. So this is not an official position. This is what I'm working on within my organization. But in my ideal world, and the men in the audience would relate to this, you're a citizen, you turn 18, just like selective service, you get your card, you're now in the selective service, you're automatically registered to vote. And there could be an opt-out, because, if you don't want to participate, that's your right. But you're automatically registered to vote, and that vote moves with you, because the other challenge we have in our system, and a lot of people don't realize, is every time you move, you have to update your registration. And the way this has been manipulated is that, I talked about provisional ballots. What Harvard says, you have to give someone a ballot if they believe they're eligible, even if they're not on the rolls. But Harvard did not talk about how you count that ballot. So in states like Ohio and Florida, they say if you're in the wrong precinct, we're not going to count your ballot, even for races that apply statewide, countywide, presidential. And so we have the problem of voters being handed a provisional ballot, believing that they're casting a vote that will count, and it not counting. And there was actually a recent victory yesterday in Ohio, because Ohio was particularly insidious, because you had to be in the right precinct for your vote to count. They had several precincts in the same room. So you can get to the right polling place, get to the right room, go to the wrong table, and cast a ballot and not have it count. And the court just recently said, no, you have to count those ballots for the races that apply across the board, county and statewide and national races. So, it's about the openness of the system and ensuring and welcoming all eligible voters to participate in a democracy. But instead what we've been seeing are these restrictions being placed on voters. And from the calls we got into the hotline, voters feeling this mistrust and defiance of the system. And we've gotten to the point now where part of our messaging to voters is, you have to be a VIP. Verify your voter registration before you go to the polls. Know what type of ID you need, and are you at the right polling place? So increasingly you have to work harder to have access to our democracy, and that's just not right, wrong direction.
I listened to you both, and, I as someone who follows this stuff, and I listen to how you're breaking it down, and I hear you say, there's not a lot of real fraud going on out there, even though people think there is. But what I hear from you is there's a lot of of really problematic administration in terms of the various, going to the wrong precinct table in one polling place with 5 precincts available, right? And so one of the bigger issues, it seems to me, is how people are kind of taking advantage of problems in the administration of the elections to create an unequal playing field. Would that be a kind of accurate analysis of it? Because, I hear, on one hand, there's not really a big, huge threat of fraud, yet we have these third-party, people registering and taking advantage of the system, potentially throwing people away. Robocalls saying, "Oh, vote on Wednesday," and then like this crazy thing in Ohio that you just talked about. So I know you got to chip away at it at every level, but where's is the biggest starting point just in having a knowledgeable electorate?
I mean, I do believe, and in my particularly cynical moments, that one of the lessons learned from Florida was not just that there are ways that our election administration system needs to be improved and we need to work on it, but also, there are ways that we can use our election administration system to influence the outcome of elections. Because as I said, the elections are so close now, it's on the margins. And so there is this movement, and because for example, all the states that have passed these restrictive laws, they're fraud, but when you get behind the fraud argument, there's nothing there. It's a straw man. But yet, as you mentioned, there is this perception in the public that, there is fraud out there. And then you sort of get buried in the weeds, because if you get caught up in the fraud argument, there are types of fraud. Like, easiest thing would be absentee ballot fraud. They are, and so you can understand why people believe that there's fraud in the system. And so it just becomes very complicated. And we're in a soundbite society, and it's just hard to make those arguments, and that's taken advantage of. And so all we can do is try to take a step back and focus on ensuring all eligible voters can vote, and coming from that lens instead of the fraud lens, and that's our counter.
Yeah, I think there's no surprise that we agree. I mean, first, if you have a long time to talk about something, you have to start from the proposition it's legitimate to be concerned about the potential for an election to be fraudulent, because there are fraudulent elections in the world, and that's important. In my own opinion, if we went back and deconstructed Florida, you can see some elements of fraud that were involved in Florida in 2000. You can see some elements of bad administration that were involved in Florida. You can see some elements of other things that were involved in Florida that make up for more, and each of them make up for more than 537 votes. So there's a real reason to be concerned about these things, about having really integrity, elections with integrity. So, and I would concede that there are even some examples of people who have impersonated. They seem to be 2, 3, 4 here or there, scattered, not big risks, but okay. And this problem with mail-in ballots, there are potential problems with people saying they're somewhere where they're not. You receive a ballot, I fill it out for you. I receive a ballot, the two of you look over my shoulder and pressure me on how it's not a secret ballot. There are problems with elections and a lot of things. But I do believe that to keep the eye on the prize, the fundamental point is to have a democratic system, which no one in this country would argue against. You have to have universal and equal suffrage, which means you have to work very, very hard to extend the franchise to all of the eligible people and to make them feel welcome and included. So, when I write about these things or talk about these things, overseas, and it applies here, I think you have to start with inclusion. That's universal and equal suffrage, and you can break out a lot of things behind it. You have to include transparency, because that's the only way to know that it is truly honest rather than fraudulent. And you have to have accountability. And it's accountability for a citizen who impersonates someone else. It's accountability for an election official who disenfranchises and turns somebody away. It's accountability for someone who places a call to another person and says vote on Tuesday or on Wednesday rather than Tuesday, or other things that happen out there. Because not only is there this legal battle, there's the example that you gave. There are a lot of dirty tricks that are taking place out there too. They're hard to identify and to prove. And we could go through them among us. I'm sure we all know what they are. But it's keeping your eyes on the prize and really trying to have our other citizens be part of this system. And that's the only way it's really going to reflect what we think is a genuine democracy.
We have time probably for one more question.
I guess I was wondering what you two thought about the role that states and like kind of state sovereignty on the issues of elections plays in the whole election problem that we're having in the United States. Do you think that moving towards a more federally regulated system would be helpful or not? It just seems like because the states have power over their own elections, it makes it so much more complicated.
Well, of course, the Constitution gives them the right to administer elections, so we have, that hurdle that we would need to cross. But there is also the opportunity for the federal government to step in under Article 1, Section 4, I believe, in terms of having baseline. So we do have, the Help America Vote Act, for example, which is under that provision that says you have to provide provisional ballots. So there is an opportunity for the federal government to step in and put baseline requirements that the states would have to meet. And I think there are opportunities there that are worth pursuing. The challenge for us is that we are in this very divided federal government. But I do think, and I really appreciate the frame of talking about an open, accessible democracy to all eligible voters and using that as a frame from which to have this debate. And that is something that, one of the things that I really like about my job is that I get to do a little bit of everything. So we get to do the advocacy, the programmatic work, and the litigation. And I think that's what's needed, is this process of this approach that encompasses all three. Because we really, we can't just have the battle on one front. So we work within the states to try to improve the laws within the states, but also working with the federal government, like we have the Deceptive Practices and Anti-Intimidation Prevention Act that we were pushing in the federal government, pushing in the states. So it does require us to work on both fronts.
Yeah, the comment on this, which is about structure of U.S. things, I can't comment from the perspective of my organization because we're barred from saying anything or getting involved in U.S. politics or what have you. But I'm a citizen, so speaking, as a citizen, I think first of all, there are a couple of things. One is federal elections have a right to set standards for federal elections, and as the Help America Vote Act, it's like as we deal with federal highway subsidies and other sorts of things, you can buy in or not. And the federal government does have enough clout by offering funding and other sorts of assistance for states to buy in. It sounds a little bit like Obamacare, I know, but this is a tried and true principle. I do believe we can improve the procedures for voting across the country. That's one thing. The second thing is, we do have a federal system, and within a federal system, states do have control, and we've given them control. We're not going to change that in the electoral arena. And there will be a debate, just like there's a debate over marriage and over other things within the states. I think those of us who are concerned with electoral integrity nationally should be raising a number of issues in a broad citizens campaign. And one of them should be the administrators of elections should be politically impartial as well as administratively competent and effective. And to look at the way elections are run in this country, which gives them to the states, and which most states then give the power to oversee elections to the Secretary of State. And most secretaries of state are statewide elected offices that are sought by candidates from a political party. means that you can end up with an election administration, the top of which is a Kathleen Harris in 2000 in Florida, who's simultaneously on the Republican campaign committee for one of the candidates for president. That's a conflict of interest that I don't believe would stand scrutiny under any other aspect of U.S. jurisprudence. But it's part of our political culture, and therefore our courts don't strike that down. But citizens should make a demand about that. There are a lot of things about electoral integrity that I think we could take up and should take up. And at the end of the day, it's really making the ground right for citizens then to make the choices about who they want. I mean, it's very political if a system can be set up to prevent certain people from even participating, especially if you look and see that those people tend to vote one way or another. Every country has that fight. It's the nature of competition, whether it's sports or politics or other things. But it's how do you really create a system that is indeed fair? And I think you hit on that. You'll be talking about when your hair is gray like mine and sitting at tables. This is something that's going to be going on for a long time.
With that, it is your charge, and it is our charge together to watch. Well, first of all, to vote. Second of all, to watch. Third of all, to report, and hopefully to protect and defend the right to free and fair elections in this country and around the world. For those of you who are interested in getting more involved, I would encourage you to join with the nonpartisan efforts of the Lawyers Committee. The training will take place tomorrow at 11 o'clock. I think in this room is what they said.
100.
Like I said, in room 100, as they said. And I encourage all of you to exercise those rights on November 6th for whichever party you decide to vote for, and come for trick-or-treat treats on October 31st at our next event. Thank you very much to Pat and Marcia. Thank you for taking your time out of your busy schedules and for joining us. Thank you all very much.